Hello everyone, today we talk about Milites and pedites in the second half of 11th century Milan. We've never made a video specifically on the Italian communal infantry. We made something about knights, about Milites. We also discussed through the political and institutional lens also the military meaning of these fighters that, as you know, are all over. This is the basic conventional standard definition for cavalry and infantry all over Europe, but that in the case of the Italian communes were ever more sort of framed within a civic and in fact public army, right? Military participation on the basis of the commune that would evolve into city-states, right? And as you know, if you have been following me from a while, there is a very rich chapter in Italian military history that it reaches its peak of relevance and importance for the history of the art of war, especially in the 13th and the first part of the 14th century. Practically an almost unknown one for, say, contemporary pop culture about medieval warfare, and that I like to discuss because, in fact, it's this more mature and developed phase of the great armies of the great medieval civilization. In fact, there is a better-known period that is fundamentally from the mid-12th to the mid-13th century as the wars of the Lombard League, which technically stretched also for a longer time. I mean, the Lombard League did not disappear after the wars against the Swabians, and it was just like a regular form of military association in the central and western Po Valley, in particular, Milan, of course, being a bit like the cornerstone of this alliance, which is, again, known mostly because of its exploit at battles like Carcano, Legnano, etc. Like, so we're looking at also Cortenuova. Regardless also of the outcomes, Legnano was such big victory also in a broader political sense. Cortenuova was a defeat. But that illustrate, in any case, in these cases, in particular, but also in others, like we talk about Lombardy, by the way, we sometimes include also the Bolognese army that also, for example, at Fossalta did score important results. The Emilians, also, the Parmesans against Frederick II at some point, but we mostly remember them because of infantry power, and that was really at the peak in Europe exactly, especially in this 100 years, like mid-12th, mid-13th century in Lombardy, and that would actually remain like that high also for another century, at least, right? Then I'm not going to digress on the rest, but because the point I wanted to make is that there is yet another sort of lesser known period instead that is in fact the previous one. The previous one of, you can argue 1 century before, so 1050, 1150, let's put it in this way, which is well documented enough to describe the development of Milites and pedites in Italy, and that, however, has as its premise, as its prodrome, like a much less documented history, unfortunately, even though these are among, if not the most documented realities in Europe for those centuries before as well, that as far as I understand from a historiographical point of view, haven't really been even explored in the sense of let's look at what kind of infantry power existed in the Italic. You can go even back to the Longobard kingdom. Indeed, I studied the latter, for example, coming from the migration era, more in depth than say Italic warfare between the 9th and 11th century. Albeit I made a video exactly titled like this some month ago. But just as an introduction, as a general approach to, okay, let's see what this is about. Now, why is this topic interesting? Well, you immediately understand from a number of reasons. The first, more evident one is, again, the Italians would rise, and in particular the Lombards in those higher medieval centuries, as, again, the strongest infantrymen, plus together with their cavalry, and so this fierce communal armies that really made the history of medieval European warfare, facing the imperial heavy cavalry at its top, especially in the 13th century, like in open field, face to face, and also, in fact, giving a lot of confidence to the other sort of communes, let's call it in this way, also not just in a political but in a personal sense, all over Europe, that were proven that you could face feudal power and emerging victorious. In the Italian case, this would always be achieved through cavalry, however, as we have already seen, especially in those videos dealing with the infantry-only victories of the early 14th century. Actually, the parts of Europe where infantry was more developed at large did not have infantry-only victories, and it's not, even such a huge deal as that progressistic, modernistic focus on this still very important, very clamorous events, also for the times being, surely come back. We have to cover them all to begin with. I made a video about the Battle of Courtrai, in part, like another program was the Battle of Stirling Bridge, but that's not really actually a proof of great infantry strength. That's my topic in many ways. I can say I specialize on infantry also because I like cavalry more, but I did start also in a sort of doctoral sense from these kind of questions. So you understand, and this is true in Italian history also at sea, for example, that all this great military power was not made overnight, right? It wasn't invented from a moment to another. And so if, say, as we will see in part today, the Milanese or other communal forces in the peninsula were, so organized, so developed, this stems from a military culture that's much older than that, right? Where do, like, for example, the Italian maritime republics stem from, with that kind of, top naval engineering and capacities within the Mediterranean, taking over basically all its ports. If up to, a century before, like, we don't at least see certain aspects of that, or the establishment of the commune, right, or that long-range strategic activity, of course, because at some point the Saracens were still there at the end of the so-called Golden Age of Islam. But that, in fact, is also connected to a problem of documentation, right? We don't get, even up to the 13th, the 14th century, really a clear idea of what, especially battles were, tactical reconstruction-wise. So we hear of, especially a lot of warfare, of course, happening in these areas, and really the Italic kingdom is recognized by lots of scholars as likely the single most belligerent one throughout at least these very centuries. And if you look at the resources invested, like, it's insane, and the Italians basically continue with that. If you consider, especially later in the later Middle Ages, like all the kind of financial and trade dominance that they had, again, they mostly reinvested in warfare and in building up like this provincial and then regional states that are actually as powerful as entire realms in numbers and strength. However, what did happen, say, in the previous centuries, say the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, like, what was there before the communes? I made another video that responds to this question from a strictly political point of view, like, what was there in the Italian cities, government-wise, military-wise, before the communes, that are sort of the word there that we find also in other parts of Europe, and that designates what does really reach the peak in that sense in the continent, exactly in the Italian peninsula. That's a hell of a question. I don't think that, let's say, it's obvious that there was a lot behind this, but the problem is that historiography-wise, we can't simply research more than much, right? The battles, for example, that are literally from a sort of in open field confrontation, like the fundamental moment, right, where you can test the various arms strength, up to, again, in, say, the later Middle Ages, do not really tell us too much, right? We understand here and there, of course, that this, I don't know, that this knight or these knights did something like the infantry, but it's all often separated, like it's more like notionistic info about this or that encounter, rather than telling us, okay, so we can reconstruct that battle and know exactly what, you know, these armies' tactics really were. This is a problem that we have pretty much for any other place in the world at this point. We don't know. With just that level of historiographical development, that mirrors also the civilization one, does not allow us to know this, even for the West, that is overwhelmingly the best documented, and I would say already at this point most advanced part of the world. Even though, you know, you have been told, well, we don't know, maybe, you know, in other parts, in quality-wise, I think, honestly, and I've been studying this for decades, and I also believed at the beginning, like, we can't really say, in order were surely, like, sort of some equivalent militaries, in terms of, sort of, at least conventional power that surely match more or less, like, the most developed civilizations across Eurasia weren't that different from one another. But even historiography is the mirror of some, at least it's not directly proportional to the quality of armies. Like, there can be some cultural reasons that show you more or less, in fact, of these that are reflected into literature, and so in ways that we can't document. But I think it would be interesting, and I'm awaiting for this in Schwerpunkt, in fact, to dig way more into this previous centuries of the Italic kingdom to actually get the proper answer, something sort of bit more consistent, because the main problem is that, aside from the lack of documentation, there aren't really comparative models that you can simply draw. Like, archaeology can do a bit, like also iconography. Like, if you look at these various pictures, for example, I use in the same videos, you realize that, I don't know, at the material level, these warriors were basically the same across Europe. Infantry, we realize in the highly civilized Italy was something very important. In fact, it does seem that such military, say, foot military capacity was continuing from a time that could date as back as the late antiquity, as a matter of fact. I mean, that sense of municipal pride that the later Italian city-states would basically sort of parade at a sort of more resounding historical level during the, say, humanism, the Renaissance, etc. It's something that was already there from millennia. This is also something I am discovering about history, that regardless of changes, more or less, at least as far as I've seen with European peoples, and this is surely the same for others, like what these people were 2,000 years ago, in a fundamental way, at least some fundamental characteristics of their national spirit is fundamentally the same, has been the same forma mentis, the same attitude to certain aspects. And we do have actually an overwhelming amount of evidence about this continuity. Right, from one side we have a bit more sort of Anglo-Saxon side of the story that emphasized, because mostly of the situation of the British Isles and even in the more developed Anglo-Saxon world at the time, that was a major fracture with the ancient world. It was a sort of dark age and everything was sort of falling apart and whatever. When we look at Southern Europe generally, the more we do, also from for example, early medieval archaeology is very interesting and incredibly underrated, right? I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not really bombarding you with this all the time, but the few that I've been able to grasp about the complete lack, like the disproportionately absurd lack of archaeological investment in early medieval stuff, for example, compared especially to Southern Europe, where you have, I don't know, the Greeks, the Romans, so it's easier in a sense to find and invest in that stuff because archaeology is unfortunately also business in many ways. As historians, we're less corruptible. Really tells us something insane to the level of there were entire cities in the midst of the Italian peninsula that we basically, like, it's not just we didn't know from ancient history having existed, but literally like rising and falling those centuries between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages that nobody ever even, pictured in the scene. And it's a big deal, I think. Like, I don't know how familiar you are with sort of the depth of historical archaeological awareness about the old continent, but really we have a very capillary understanding of history, and this provides us still with the most amazing realization that it's not just that we have such a shockingly abundant history in Europe, but that there is way more than we actually thought, even at this point, that there was, and people are simply sitting on it without really doing much. Like, you can't even, if we were to dig everything from sort of any European country, let's leave aside Italy now, of course, the most extreme case, but it's like, I don't think there is enough money for anywhere, possibly in the entire globe, to invest into the actual digging of everything that there is to dig, right? So we live in this incredibly frustrating situation, which is utterly insane. But fortunately, the fact that Italy is the single most archaeologically stratified country in the history of mankind allows us to have, at the end of the day, some important evidence regarding this very stratification. We know from, say, late antique epigraphies, even in cities like Milan or Pavia, etc., that these families of magnates, of people who were rich enough to have, in fact, this public monuments, signaling their power, their ancestry, their privilege, the sense of a municipal communitary identity, the same, in fact, urban fabric surviving throughout the centuries, remaining always active, highly, again, per capita rich, highly literate, part of, especially in the case of the Longobard, that is the Italic kingdom, very well administered, very well organized, very well, I'd say also very centralized in many ways, and interconnected in these cities that have a very old, in fact, military association. In the Po Valley, it's especially striking because everything is sort of open, and you have all these former Roman districts that also in the migration era not just survive but go on, like under the Longobard kingdom too, simply have a very similar administration, and eventually in the feudal era, making the cities bonding. There are just some tens of kilometers from one another, and it's very easy to sort of interplay and sort of stimulate further civil military development. And we know how difficult it was, in fact, also in at the time of the Salians, of the Ottonians as well before, but especially the Hohenstaufen in a more clamorous way, to control this kingdom, or even attempting to do so, like the enormous amount of investment that this required. And this obviously reflects a military organization that, again, unfortunately, we can't see up to a certain point in history, but that reflects a praxis that could be, I think, still within the limits of the sources, a very interesting topic for a doctoral research. Now, Milites and pedites in Milan. Milan is located at the core of, essentially, together with northern France, the most developed part of Europe, the more productive, and Milan is also, in fact, with Paris, could be the largest city in the West. And today we will talk about this phase that is essentially the Patarian one, which is one of those topics that if I make a video about history of religions, everybody will yawn and say, oh, okay, we don't want to listen to this, it's boring, like, what do we care about this ecclesiastical stuff we've never heard of, whatever. we have seen, of course, in multiple videos why the Pataria movement was important. To make the thing extremely long story, let's put it in this way, extremely short. Essentially, this was a popular, well, not at some traits like populist-backed, at least, movement of essentially Guelph character that the popes used in order to pressure the imperial presence in Milan. That is to say, like the activity, the government of some German-placed authorities that wanted essentially to maintain a feudal establishment in the Italic kingdom. And all this during the most obviously turbulent years of the investiture controversy. Milan was the center of this all, right, for many reasons, fundamentally because, as we've seen, it was essentially the most important city around, and it was close to, basically, to Monza, to Pavia, and so they're just like a few tens of kilometers apart, the core of the Italic kingdom. And so these sees, not just like the former capitals of the kingdom, that were still in fact used theoretically as this also by the German emperors, where, however, these needed to be crowned with the Italic diadem, the Iron Crown, in order to be crowned Holy Roman Emperors in Rome, right? We've covered this very, very often. Like, it didn't matter, like, if you were, I don't know, Western or Eastern Frankish king, Burgundian, well, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered is that you had the Italic crown in order to access the Holy Roman Imperial one. Because of the obvious fact that if you wanted to arrive in Rome and essentially resisting any opposition you could find, you would have, first of all, like, to stabilize the Italic kingdom, getting there with an expedition and so just making sure that your journey to Rome would be, flowing smoothly, let's put it this way. So Milan is that central. And as we were saying before, like this urban center, we were not in the communal age yet. We're about to get there. The investiture controversy would actually foster a great deal of the communal rise. We've seen it in many videos. We discussed the origins of the Italian communes, how they formed, what they technically were. The consular regime, that is the one that establishes the commune as a political, in fact, community, is properly an expression of the milites, of the military class. And the investiture controversy is key here because it obviously was unhinging the bishop-count policy that the Holy Roman Emperors had used to rule over these cities, starting in fact from the episcopal authority as essentially ecclesiastical princes of the empire. Now the commune substitutes it to this, or at least sort of hijacks even the episcopal government that has specific, in fact, public prerogatives over the district. The commune basically takes that over, even, say, formally acting on behalf of that, but eventually expanding the journey of this otherwise, in fact, lay power that will eventually consolidate in the later Middle Ages into actual city-states and even regional states, of which Milan is also one of the most famous cases. We discussed recently, among the other things, I don't know, Milanese armor, right, of how this was actually the strongest military power in Italy. And actually Milan had, again, armies of, at the same time, medieval France could have 30,000 from the royal side, exactly 30,000 also in this case. And so we're talking that scale of military organization and wealth and affluence. The second half of the 11th century is not just a great moment of expansion for all the West and beyond, but it's also the age of crusades. So you have a lot of, think about for example, the crusaders that passed through, they crossed the Alps in order to get to southern Italy, to go embark themselves for the Holy Land. It's an extremely international reality for many reasons. And so there is a figure I want to discuss today that we mentioned in the videos about the Pataria movement in Milan as the leader of the same political current, let's put it in this way. That is a Miles. It's a knight. Erlembald. Now, this is a very, let's say, fascinating figure because it's one of the few cases of secular holiness that we documented also in the Albernian case of Gérald de Aurillac, not Gerbert de Aurillac, Pope Sylvester II, that in the first case, from the pen of Adolphe Cluny, represented in fact, a veritable, we were talking about this just recently, multiple videos, that sense of truly sacred knight that was, for this reason, probably a holy warrior in the broader sort of vision of imperial order on Earth. We discussed in multiple videos, especially the one about medieval Cremona, how especially the Lombard knights saw themselves at this point in very bold terms, for example, in relation to imperial authority. In the Cremonese case, we have seen that the symbol of the city, I think still today, is the golden globe held by a hand that refers to yet another, in fact, to a knight, a Cremonese knight that had taken this golden globe that was the habitual Cremonese tribute to the Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, this guy seizes it for himself and donates it to his would-be wife, right? Which tells you all the cocky attitude that the Lombards basically would keep displaying, to the point of going directly to war against the Holy Roman Emperor. And that sort of signifies the very strong and especially traditional Romano-Germanic understanding of what it meant to wear the cingulum militaris. Right? This where you see some of you keeps asking me things like, what about the communes? Like, they were actually, what were they? Were they anarchic? Were they libertarian? Were they Republican? Were they democratic? What was? They were run by knights, right? They're the same people who actually thought that they would have been better ruling themselves by themselves, in that sort of traditional view of, I'm actually even better than the Holy Roman Emperor and can afford by blood and divine grace, of course, this kind of that. So Erlembald has this characteristic. He's actually fighting for the pro-papal faction. In other words, he's supporting this movement that is very complex, right? It does involve, again, different groups within the city. You can't quite simply or straightforwardly say that it's, again, as we said before, a popular, populistic movement because of figures like Erlembald himself. If anything, as we will see now, there are knights and infantrymen fighting under him in these urban battles that took place in Milan during these struggles. They were incredibly brutal phenomena, like people cut to pieces, burned alive. Not just in this case, but for example, also by the imperial officials who were sent there, including like episcopal power. There was a lot of sort of heterodoxy around as well. That paradoxically, the same popes were not, say, doctrinally fueling, but say were using like these useful idiots that in fact could go anywhere because the consular regime would install itself. And yes, the more advanced areas of Europe, if you look at, I don't know, Milan, Lyon, say the Rhone Valley, Provence, the Rhineland, etc., they all, Occitania in general, these are all the places where the Cathars will spread, right? But it's not like they will ever, aside from places like Toulouse, and not even technically, the heretics will ever be in actual power. You have Arnold of Brescia, as a matter of fact. It was in fact a Lombard that caused that uprising in Rome that brings to the expulsion of the papacy. And this is actually the reason why Frederick Barbarossa descended the first time into Italy, regardless of the actually sort of more important issue of Milan bullying Lodi. That was the main reason, but formally still creating or like properly bringing the Roman commune on the fore, where in fact in later times, the second half of the 12th century, but this is just the very colored and articulated Italic reality. Remember that at the beginning of the century, there still was, with Arduin of Ivrea, for example, it was a Piedmontese nobleman, like and that controlled great swaths of Lombardy at point, in fact, also Milan. The Italic rebellion against Henry II, the last Ottonian, that managed to crush this revolt, but that showed that still there was a sort of Italic feudal power that was actually aiming even at the Holy Roman Imperial command, right? Given not much just like the greater proximity to Rome from Lombardy than Germany, but a veritable sense of the existence of a military class, right? This backed also by this, as we've seen, Romano-Germanic spirit deriving from the idea, by the way, that the cives, the citizens of these communes, or the city in itself, were actually freemen. And not just freemen, ideally, but freemen in arms. I mean, even the pedites were, aside from, like, they were property citizens, and then sort of the urbanized peasants that were sort of the fourth estate were something else, but the citizens, even fighting on foot, these people were actually free people. We've seen it yesterday in the video about the German peasants' revolt in the 16th century, that historically in Germany, and already at this point, of course, in the 11th to 12th century, when the wars with the Lombard League happened, the majority of Germans were somebody else's people, right? The overwhelming majority, like of the population, were de facto serfs as peasants, to the degree that there wasn't something like, I don't know, I'm a town, I'm simply a citizen. They were basically just knights out there. In the Italic kingdom, you have, since, and we see this, for example, throughout the Longobards era, that next to the sort of the cavalry that you would expect from a migration era context being, in fact, the upper arm and a bit the protagonist, but more of that later, for the Ottonian era at least, there were always these infantry contingents that you do not really see so active, for example, north of the Alps, right? So that's that embryonal and unfortunately scarcely documented reality in this kingdom that, as you know, that won't really take off, right? At some point, in fact, the communes are some sort of substitution of that feudal system through the same knights that designed to create the commune, to urbanize from quite a while already, but this had always been more or less the case since Longobard, since Carolingian times. But that, when you don't see feudalism that still is scattered around, especially like the pre-Alpine areas and this places, some sort of less urbanized parts of the Po Valley, still, however, has this massive concentration in the city. And that's basically, as we were saying before, comparing also the size of armies with literal kingdoms, like where that power is concentrated. And so, of course, what will remain the characteristic of the Italic kingdom is that more or less this crown pertains now, in a traditional sense, to the Germanic rulers, if they come, of course, to the peninsula. And that will, at a point, actually be good king. We've seen this in case of Lothar III, Conrad III. Like, there is this Italo-German cooperation that, aside from the more sort of echoing Lombard League wars, etc., like, it was actually pretty functional. It was actually pretty effective. Exactly also because of the compliance of these Italic vassals and communes, like as such, of course, of the ultimate universal authority. But that, of course, will remain as a power scattered in all these various centers that act all as little kingdoms on their own and do not actually confederate to the degree that will also, again, the Lombard League is some sort of alliance, and then just later, this city-states will begin to swallow one another into bigger systems, but never having like an Italian national monarchy, right? That's why Erlembald is interesting, because he was fighting like crazy as an actual miles, as an actual knight, during the turbulent years of the Pataria movement, right? And this is also a relatively unknown, say, when you, I mean, find on YouTube anybody who talks about this guy. I think there may be just, given that he was made saint by the Pope because he had served the Guelph cause, and he was killed, as we will see now, in combat. Remember, self-sacrifice in holy combat, all the story, sainthood. We often talk with the also pre-Christian Catholic tradition. It's actually an immense amount of military expenses, but probably of major wars fought during the investiture controversy in Germany, more famously enough for that reason. Think about, I don't know, the Saxon Revolt, etc., but also in Lombardy, in ways that we sort of didn't make our own in pop culture, because it seems like, I don't know, you don't clearly understand what was going on. You just sort of lack normally, like, even the background to understand like the factions or who was who here, but still having to learn the fundamentals of what even the communes were, what this investiture controversy was actually about. Erlembald has an unknown birth date, bit of biography here, but he was killed on April the 15th, 1075, as we will see. His existence is documented through letters from Peter Damian. I made a video about this great theologian, in fact, saint. One also displaying this extreme capacity in terms of, from one side, hermetic lifestyle, self-flagellation, etc., but on the other hand, a boundless juridical education and incredible political prestige in the communes of this era to settle matters, to regulate all these issues during the controversy between the bishops, the lay authority, and so on. Gregory VII does talk, of course, about Erlembald, because it was, in fact, in his years, like he died the same year of the Dictatus Papae, for that matter. More of that made videos on Gregory VII's sort of pontificate, and sort of in the broader context of, in fact, the so-called Gregorian reforms. And narrative sources such as Arnulf's Liber Gestorum Recensium and Landulf Senior's Historia Mediolanensis, both of which are critical of him, telling the truth, and in part because they were, of course, more pro-empire, and or they disliked that sort of also the background of sort of Erlembald movement. Erlembald emerged in 1063, succeeding his brother Landulf as the leader of the Saint Pataria movement. Initially hesitant, he became actively involved after receiving the support of Pope Alexander II in the same Rome. Consider also this figure, this people's life. It's not like there was a guy living in Milan one day deciding to enter the fray for no reason, because he was woken up by the clash and decided to participate. It was like sort of even international character in his action. Under his leadership, the Patarian movement adopted military characteristics, and this is obviously not a coincidence, given that he was a knight, and there was a reason why. In fact, also the people of Milan required such support from because you see, in theory, the knights were connected to the imperial hierarchy, but many of them are siding now towards this sort of more proto-communal direction that wanted essentially to autonomize itself from imperial interference in the election of the bishops. You understand how all the instances of church reforms were sort of intertwined with this. And this is when, in fact, the reformation of the local Milanese church was also supported by Erlembald, opposing the Archbishop Guy d'Avellate, which instead was, in fact, more a pro-imperial character. Following Ariel's death in 1066, this had been another commander of the movement. Erlembald regained control of the same after this initial shattering, attempting to reorganize it with the backing of the Vallombrosan Church. This was a group of reformers from the famous Abbey of Vallombrosa. However, Erlembald faced increasing challenges in maintaining unity and support from the Milanese population itself. Because, again, there were mixed interests and very sort of both vertical, horizontal decisions. Again, we're making it simple, but it's not that simple. Despite his efforts to facilitate the election of a new Archbishop of Milan, these attempts were unsuccessful, and in 1071, following repeated fires in the city and escalating tensions, his authoritarian approach, remember he was a Miles, got a very traditional idea of how things should have been handled, sparked a revolt. Erlembald was ultimately killed, as we will see now, during a confrontation on Easter Sunday in 1075, which added to his holy sacrifices, put in this way, a death in rebirth, or better, a rebirth in death, right? And his death, in fact, did not signify the end of the Pataria movement either, which continued, in fact, to influence the religious life of Milan, that was anyhow heading, in fact, towards a communal future. In fact, that would entail the marginalization of this more extremistic religious movement, because again, that's the point. You often use these more violent fringes, but then to establish what you want, and then you remain also sign marked by this, because again, this heterodox presence will remain until the 13th century, the integration of the sort of the more some even of the most borderline orthodox movements stemming from this reformistic background into the Church of Rome, right? But this is how Milan further autonomizes. The Germans have a lot of issues at this point with the investiture controversy, the civil wars that are sparked. I will soon make a sort of a chronology of German events to learn by heart if you want to know the history of the German kingdom, that explains you how these things were happening exactly in the same way in Germany to counter the imperial authority. So there's a lot in this figure. Erlembald, for example, became a symbol of the Crusaders, interestingly enough, because he sacrificed himself essentially for a religious cause. He represented a knight legitimized by the Pope who wielded force in the name of the Church. However, his connection to the papacy placed him at odds, as we've seen, with the same communal interests of the Milanese, because Milan, and especially her sort of communally controlled church now, had always wanted to maintain a certain autonomy from the same Rome. So actually the papacy wanted to accomplish the bigger goal of keeping the emperor outside of Italy as long as possible, but the Milanese too wanted the same, but they also felt like they owed not much to the Pope after all, and so these more fringe movements that not even the Pope liked from a doctrinal point of view, of course, were increasingly marginalized, right? And in fact, the Milanese commune preferred to maintain local traditions and ties to secular power as well, being recognized, being cooperative with the emperor. You know, there was a very strong connection between Swabia and Lombardy. We've seen it in some videos, if I'm not wrong, the one about Frederick Barbarossa, not just for the obvious expeditions to Italy, but also for the matter of the dukedom, of the sort of the general, say, points of reference that the Lombard cities had, together with many other southwest German ones in Barbarossa's vision. It's as if, from a regional point of view, his place where he could draw power was essentially mostly southwestern Germany and northwestern Italy, right? In a more formal sense. And of course there were many other centers, but we will have to look at that source as well. So let's look at this clash in which Erlembald dies, because at least there is the story. There are sources that tell us something about the military context in which he died. We're not even going to emphasize his death per se, but just what kind of forces it was using in this urban battles in this clash between two civic factions. Remember, this were city clashes between, like, within the city streets. Like there is all a technicality there. I'm actually researching on just right now, or just writing some of that in an article I will likely publish next year. Erlembald prepared in this clash, quote, the knights, the foot soldiers destined for transporting the siege ladders, supplies, and various kinds of war machines, secretly arranging crossbowmen, slingers, and ladders 20 cubits high, iron reinforced at the base, able to stand on their own. Right? And so here, when the moment of battle arrived, the commander, quote, clad in a remarkable suit of armor, mounted a chestnut horse while wielding the banner, and theatrically pulling out his beard, quote, to instill greater terror, charging first into the enemy ranks. However, overconfident in his recurring fortune, he fell immediately, pierced through. Right, the source of this, for all those people who say, "Oh, you don't cite sources, whatever," listen to my videos. You will find that I cite sources all the time. This well-known episode is documented, in fact, in the work of Landulf Senior, titled Mediolanensis Historia Libri IV, the one that we mentioned before, in fact, is one of the most important sources for Milanese history, in this case, warfare of the time. Now, there are so many interesting aspects that we'll understand here, especially also in relation to the infantry. We see crossbowmen, slingers, right? And these ladders that were used to assault the enemy fortifications within the cities. Remember that what we said before about Italian feudalism essentially reversing itself into the city, also in a materially wealthy sense, right? The idea that castles were actually, the entire Lombard countryside was dotted in castles. There were at least 10s for even 100 square kilometers, and all the cities looked fortified, right? This is something we tend to forget about, even, in fact, the Italian cities that went through their Renaissance. Urbanistics raised the towers, raised the walls. They began to build something else. But say, I don't know, even Rome, as you see it, it's mostly ancient and Renaissance. Plus, of course, like, the outer you go, the other modern contemporary monuments. But at some point, like, this was a massively fortified city, like with literally every single bridge, every single house of the major nobility, like you have the militia towers, like if you look at the Trajan's Forum, like, on the right, like between Trajan's Forum and the landscape, like the rest of the Forum and the house of the Knights of Malta, there's a massive tower that dates to the 13th to the 14th century. That gives you an idea, right? A bit like Bologna, like all the skyscrapers, San Gimignano in Tuscany, like that's for some of the few places where you see what kind of, imagine the entire skyline covered like this. This was actually insane. By the 11th century, of course, that had not reached the peak yet, but Milan was, again, the largest city, with Paris possibly the larger even than Paris at this point, because we don't know actually which one was the biggest also in the later centuries, but we're talking about in the West, like the most fortified scenario you can imagine. It's interesting to think of battles in this context, right? And you see this guy in armor, of course, mounting the chestnut horse. And there is this very curious detail that he pulls out his beard in a theatrical way to show his virility, his manliness in face of the enemy, to instill greater terror, the source of Landulfus tells. This is interesting because Milan is very much like in the core land of at least Lombardy, right? Telling the truth, this area was much more Romanized in Lombard times than, even if it takes the name of Lombardy after them, but say, I don't know, northeastern Italy was much more in the interest of Germanization, sort of, in fact, influenced by the Lombard settlement. What would become Lombardy was already Milan was so important, had also been the capital of the West, and there were more Romans, and in fact these areas are sort of more Romanized, but they also had gained the sense of we are Longobards as well within the whole Roman Empire, right? And that the Longobards were famous. Paul the Deacon tells us there was also a fresco, I think, in Pavia that went lost, made by Queen Theodolinda, that showed the traditional attire of the Longobards that included this very long beard, which is an Odinic attribute, which, in fact, as you know, recurs in the foundational myth of the Longobards themselves, and that is, in fact, the long beard. So this may have been like a Milanese sort of Lombard way of saying we actually are the Longobards. Remember, we will quote later Liutprand of Cremona for the military in his sort of Ottonian times. That's the guy. Cremona is just, we mentioned it before, is yet another Lombard city relatively close to Milan, that literally says like that they were, like he allegedly, because the story was he was sent as an ambassador to Constantinople, and he insulted the Byzantines by calling them Romans, to say we are Longobards, Bavarians, Swabians. This guy was a Roman, he was an Italian guy. He spoke, and probably we don't know about his look, but he was, again, fundamentally an Italian by culture, by background, but he considered himself literally a German in as much, at least, as he was a Longobard, let's say better, in a national sense. And he said, we want to insult someone, we call him, oh, you Roman. Naturally, he never said this to Nicephorus in Constantinople, but the Germanic, like the Ottonian propaganda at the time, for imperial reasons, also competition over southern Italy was pretty much straightforwardly offensive towards the Byzantines, which was, also warmly reciprocated from the other side. But it's interesting because of the sense of themselves these people had, right, in the Po Valley, being an actual nation. Remember that the entire peninsula was called Longobardy, like by the Arabs, by anyone who interacted with Italians. They identified them as the Longobards, which is fair, because technically, yes, the center of the kingdom had been in the north, but as we know, with the Longobardia Minor, the Longobards, we were talking about the other day in that video about southern Italy, would actually have their own laws as part of, in fact, southern Italian legal system up to the 19th century, right? Which is very, very, very interesting as a common law legacy. But in this case, the source says, overconfident in his recurring fortune, right? By this author, by the way, Landulf, right? The wolf of the land. Like, these are very Germanically influent contexts. These traditional ideas, such as the fact that knights were chasing fortune, right? I'm actually writing an article about German mercenaries in the same Lombardy in the early 14th century, which actually, through some local Ghibelline accounts, right, that remember of the same Milan, in fact, that remembered this notion also, that this were the same time of Dante, the Ghibelline, revival tradition, etc., like that fortune was providence and the will of Jupiter, that is God, that would test his own knights, right? And there was a very strong sense of, still at that time, of Italo-Germanic knighthood, and sense that the true warrior charges in that insane way. Just the other day made a video about 12th century knightly warfare in general, like, and stressing what it meant to be a knight, like what knights technically did. And again, charging essentially a 90 kilometer per hour as a sum between the two speeds against an enemy knight is suicidal. So basically, if you don't play this major Russian roulette, you don't get anywhere. You can't win the empire, right? That's why also Erlembald here is actually becoming a saint after that, right? So he actually gets transpassed, and the source again is not making it even a matter of great, a big deal. But let's say for the time that this guy specifically, like if you wonder why these details about this specific guy, it's because of the biography and sort of his international relevance put on the fore before. So setting aside this also idealistic reasons for which Erlembald would fight, we can identify several essential elements in the preparations he undertook that characterized military techniques in the latter half of 11th century Milan. So the mention of ladders, for example, for taking houses quite explicitly, and various machines suggests the existence of numerous strongholds, as we were pointing out before, that needed to be captured one by one. Right, you don't have ways to bombard. I mean, yeah, there were actually ways to do so, but not in a way you could simply like dislodge the enemy from that easily. Siege warfare, of course, found application even within the cities, and especially in these ones. And its importance was such that it also required foot soldiers, of course, who had become, at least temporarily, like during the operations, mere auxiliaries responsible for transporting the machines and supplies. This is quite interesting because at times we do know that the same men-at-arms in other parts of medieval warfare carried the ladders themselves in the process of assaulting the enemy fortifications, right? Whilst supported by the pedites, by other, I don't know, pavismen, crossbowmen, etc. So you have actually a pretty interesting detail here that resounds with the rest of military tradition that, of course, does tell us that this was all pretty obvious, right, from a long time. This was the habitual practice and also the unavoidable, the inescapable one. There are certain fundamentals that also pretty late, even at the times firearms were already there, like would always function in the same way, like throwing stones on the assailants, this kind of, very rhythm tempo in the assault to the fortifications, etc. Nevertheless, there were, of course, combatants on foot proper, whom Erlembald kept in reserve, along with other more sophisticated siege equipment, even expecting their intervention to yield decisive effects. This included, quote, ballistas et fundibularios, which stands, like the first is a metonymia, these skilled sharpshooters, among whom the crossbowmen stood out for their relative rarity at the time and significance. Telling the truth, crossbows had always been there since antiquity, right? And we think that especially in this particularly heavily armored context, we've seen again Milanese armor, essentially in the 11th to 12th century, Lombardy is becoming the greatest center and more qualitative one in arms and armor production in Europe, right? During the previous centuries, the middle upper Rhine Valley had been, and now it's shifting here to these places. And so the crossbows, you could think, of course, were smaller, like almost catapults, like that would be ballistas themselves. Like, so there isn't even that. There were different sized weapons that could serve both in open field, which is a bit of an overlooked aspect, and but especially during siege warfare, of course, for covering fire, like destroying enemy fortifications, whatever. But here, especially against armor, against horses, right? In the city streets, the crossbowmen, the slingers, which is also interesting to find here because they for the trauma anti-armor effect, and you don't hear too much about slingers in medieval warfare, but there were, of course, plenty of, and at least the sense is that they had still a relevance that is, while being overshadowed by the bows, right? So these missile troops would be used also in an offensive way, and in ways that would even help, for example, clearing the way, entering some houses, buildings to declare the enemy presence, ensure that there wouldn't be ambushes in the nearby streets, so that just at that point the heavier cavalry even could enter these narrow paths. So important, right? And I made a video about the Western Frankish crossbowmen between the 10th and the 11th century. This could fit in general for the entirety of, say, post-Carolingian Europe. Probably especially for Italy. We know that in Germany, for example, like the bow was sort of more directly, I mean, the simple bow, the traditional bow, if you want, was more likely to be found in the crossbow, but this is just by some degree, like compared to these, especially to the Western Frankish and the Italic kingdoms. Also probably like the Burgundia, but yeah, we could extend it to other countries, but let's leave it at that. You do, however, see dominating all the imposing and fearsome figure of Erlembald himself atop his steed, clad in his source Lorica Admirabilis, so this remarkable, wonderful armor, which tells it all regarding what was the dominant arm still by this point. And believe me, in urban battles, that is not to be given so easily for granted, right? The 11th century is still a very sort of archaic, primitive time in history. The full dominance of heavy cavalry in open field, not even it's the second half of the 12th century, right? Still in open field, infantry is pretty strong. At this point, for example, during the wars that Henry IV is fighting, just in this very years, in fact, against the rebel German princes, you find often the same royal army dismounting, deploying behind a stream, especially in such forested and swampy place like Germany. And so, imagine even in a city with such massive impediments like fortifications, like just obstacles, how relevant it is that, in part, there was cavalry, of course, playing such an important role within. There are cases of infantry victories within the city gates, which is sort of like, not like cheating, but it's not something you can really measure the impact of infantry that in open field would have had the worst of it, with cavalry provided with the adequate spaces for deployment and sort of repeating charges and so on, maneuvering, etc. That is crucial. But still, of course, in the city streets, like these massive war horses, right, ridden by these, quite, pumped up, athletic, brutal, violent men at arms, like, would really be the thing. And the objective is always the same: smashing into people, breaking their bones, turning them into pulp, right? In this case, Erlembald gets killed. We do not know how, though. Like, he may have been killed by another knight. We just know he's transfixed. So that is also something that can happen. Even when you have this Lorica Admirabilis, as a matter of fact, which, again, there was an interesting comment the other day under the video about the fact that 12th century knights said what I been sort of saying that myself, that arms and armor, like, say, armor was probably more easily penetrated than we think, just due to the obvious degree of quality that it could have or not, right? In any case, Erlembald in this picture appeared not only as the leader, but also as the embodiment of the warrior elite, the Milites, the heavily armed knights, genuine symbols of military power and of the Imperium, in fact, in the Roman Catholic tradition. The intense internal warfare that disrupts pre-communal Milan at this point is technically characterized by the same elements that dominate the central regions, the core regions of the West, of Romano-Frankish Europe, during that period. The enduring supremacy of heavy armored cavalry, the increasing significance of portable missile weapons, and the proliferation of fortifications, which in turn leads to the parallel development of siege techniques, is all part of the typical landscape, especially of post-Carolingian Europe and beyond, right? I want to stress again that northern France and northern Italy are the single most affluent, developed, sort of updated parts in at least in post-Carolingian Europe and most of the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean. And as such, like when you look at also Milanese, Knights, etc., think that they had like a very substantial sort of material basis to draw from, which is true for the pedites as well. I made a video in the very early days of Schwerpunkt, which was, I was dealing with, in fact, the overwhelming material wealth of the communal infantries. We were reading for Milan, in fact, in that case, the famous passage by Bonvesin de la Riva, this monk of the late 13th, early 14th century, that literally tells you like the insanely large amount of crafts and arts and production wealth that was going on, especially in Milan at that time. We quoted him in that video again about Milanese armor, right? And so what we see here is, in many ways, a typical Western European context, but also with some extra pinch of material refinement. Although in many respects the aforementioned episode is thus representative of a broader reality, it does not adequately reflect, or because this is what we strongly suspect, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, the role of infantry, which both in Italy and elsewhere in Europe was certainly not confined to the humble tasks apparently assigned to them by Erlembald, like carrying, or at least in Landulf's work, that is reflective a bit of still that aristocratic elite background right in. And so, of course, these pedites would have had a much more straightforwardly impacting capacity, not just even in the city streets, but in the Lombard armies of the time, amidst all these terrible wars, like in the international scenario, the civil war both in Italy and in Germany during the investiture controversy. And so we wonder also about the type of representation here, right? Because as we were saying before, there is also a cultural dimension to this. That is to say, how was an 11th century author willing to describe actually the relevance of infantry? If, say, he belonged to the elite and he was, say, disgusted by commoners to a degree. Again, in these centers, that sense of civic participation was pretty strong, like the knights like Erlembald and others would have, including the bishops, etc., their own infantrymen. As always, like, nobody fought either just with cavalry or infantry. They regularly had this, but to say there was an enhanced understanding, of course, of the quality of this infantry. The fact that they weren't just some, underdeveloped, peasant levies from some fringe area. Like these were like pretty strong and capable footmen. If we go 1 century and more back in time, but in the same Lombardy, we mentioned him before, Liutprand of Cremona, does give us like a picture in which, for example, knights are prominent, right? But it doesn't tell us actually much about the infantry. So we see that regardless of the, say, conventional elite nature of this historiography, it is quite refined, because these are not the times and places yet in which, like, you simply have the the average citizen that writes a chronicle, like in the 13th or the 14th century, right? Or like Compagni or Villani, this kind of in vernacular, like this is still, again, it's a pre-communal era. So the idea that the Milites, as we've seen with Erlembald, would also represent one another in even at a historiographical level is pretty strong. Like these this aristocrats are definitely more important, at least in a it's difficult to say, not even in a strictly tactical sense necessarily, but they really embody a more traditionally straightforward role, especially as individual fighters, right? So in order to understand Liutprand's perspective, I think it's important to think of him not just as an ambassador or as a historian or as a man of letters, in general as a bishop, right? He was the bishop of Cremona. And that's why also in Ottonian times, like the figure of the bishop count was so unavoidably close to the emperor. We talked about that specific policy, and why bishop counts were so relevant in Germany, but especially in Italy for the imperial cause. The cities being the cornerstone effect of the latter's governance, since again, Roman times and interruptively also under the Longobards, the Franks. With Saxons, it's the same. It's important to look at Liutprand from the standpoint of his possible military experience, meaning, like, how much did this guy know about warfare in Europe and the Mediterranean? Likely a lot, right? Even though he was a different man from that. Not that even bishops were that demilitarized. As a matter of fact, as I made videos about the Carolingian, the Ottonian armies organization, and we have seen how, of course, bishops were very sort of participant to military expeditions, and this was the case of Liutprand himself. So let's look at that. He was born around 920. Think about it, right? These are the years in which Henry the Halberd, that we discussed recently, was coming to power. So people who were born when the imperial Carolingian dynasty was still there, right? So Liutprand, like having also that close sort of more even independently Longobard past, not that far away, right? And he definitely witnessed significant political and military events in Italy during this time, if anything, because of his connection with Otto the First. Liutprand, and witnessed, of course, like also the Italic political and military issues before the arrival of the Saxons. For example, he described Lothair's coronation as king of Italy in 931. Remember, these guys lived pretty close where the actual crowning would happen, as Liutprand as bishop, as at least a man of of his curriculum, of his position, would be involved. Again, these were aristocratic figures, but still living in the cities, being urbanized, being that again civil. He also missed some events. For example, he had no first-hand account of the Magyar sack of Pavia in 924, which had been a huge deal. And as a historian, that's important because Pavia was this one of the greatest tragedies in the entire history of mankind. Like the archives of Pavia were destroyed. These were the archives of the Longobard capital, right? They were destroyed, also because of the disasters, especially for the mass made around, of Berengar of Friuli in 924. However, Liutprand began his career proper in the service of Berengar of Ivrea, on the other side, around 945. There were different Berengars, sometimes is also Ivrea, we mentioned it before, but for Arduin. So again, it's interesting that this is probably like the heart of the Italic power at the time. Liutprand is famously known for the antipodesis, like that he wrote for his diplomatic missions to Constantinople. We have in 949, 950, where he gained the appreciation of the Byzantine court, but later faced a fallout with the same Berengar, prompting his refuge with Otto I of Germany, which is interesting. I think that there would be such, of course, at an Italic aristocratic level, a connection, of course, with the Eastern Frankish kingdom even when the Ottonians had not ascended in the peninsula yet. And so you have Otto's intervention in Italy, resulting in Berengar's defeat in 961. And so these were all the various partisans, like retinues and courtiers, that were gravitated around this main leader. So it's obvious that you would seek refuge when you inimicated one of them to the other side. We tend again to have a very poor understanding of how intertwined Italy and Germany were from like a very long time. You can argue since antiquity, right? Since when the Etruscan merchants prompted even the refinement, probably the Plutarch alphabet script, and you have throughout all the antiquity and late antiquity migration era, even more in this point, even more that straightforward, like Transalpine connection. Liutprand became, under Otto, as King of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor, Bishop of Cremona, and engaged in further diplomatic missions on behalf of the Emperor. In 963 he was, for example, sent to Rome to persuade Pope John XII against an alliance with Berengar. He participated in synods that led to the deposition of popes and the election of pro-imperial candidates, reinforcing Otto's influence over the papacy. Liutprand was involved in military campaigns. That's what interests us the most for today's video. For example, during Otto's confrontation with Berengar, and contributed to diplomatic efforts, including the proposal for a marriage alliance between Otto II and a Byzantine princess, as it would actually eventually function. So that's where you have his missions encountering often the challenges due to Byzantine hostility. The most successful episode, like the actual one of the Antipodes, is in 961. Despite his struggles, Liutprand remains a key figure in Otto's court, influencing decisions and policy towards the Byzantine Empire. And mostly, again, the aforementioned Antipodes represents the most important literary contribution of Liutprand, serving as an important source among his for understanding the political landscape of his times, combining his personal memoirs essentially with historical events, although they also reflect this rivalry with Berengar II. You can imagine how much of a political person he was, and how he was even involved in these negotiations over, say, military issues, literally following Otto during the campaign in Italy, and so looking at armies and how they worked. Liutprand's diplomatic skills were crucial in shaping Otto's strategies themselves and asserting the emperor's authority in Italy amidst the shifting allegiances and conflicts characteristics of late 10th century politics. So Liutprand in this surely knew very well about, for example, infantry potential, but he could potentially overlook the role of infantry altogether, because we know also the Ottonian army being sometimes stereotypically just about, say, centered on the Milites, right? And this is especially what Otto had tried to create an empire floating with this force being routinely maintained by various parts of the empire that would require his presence temporarily and then not oppressing them excessively in provincial interests. And so you realize that even though Liutprand was surely well aware of the infantry potential that the Italic kingdom already had, he would perfectly know how local militias were organized, and besides like the knights in that more traditional sense, exactly from an imperial standpoint, he would mostly reinforce the importance of cavalry and showing it mostly as also a symbol of power. I made multiple videos about the Ottonian campaigns, for example, mostly in Central Europe, and we've seen how infantry was always there, right? It could have not been otherwise, right? It was the numerical majority of all armies. And even though knights were, especially in the 10th century, as we well know, affirmed themselves as a professional military class, really separated from any other sort of previous mixture from sort of ideal sort of Romano-Germanic equality, like by now they were becoming ever more elite in so many ways. And even though, as we just observed, Longoburg Kingdom was really deploying very good infantrymen, you can't really look at the 10th century and pretend to have this overwhelming information about them. Right? If you think this is just after the 9th, where we know even less to a degree, and again, it was not far away, the times at which Aistulf was writing his recruitment laws to cope against the Carolingian invasion. We do know there was still a lot of infantry there in a very, again, migration era fashion, with cavalry being preeminent, probably the mailed horsemen like being already there. Like, we made lots of videos about also the development of Carolingian cavalry. We know the trail. But if you wanted to find like very good infantry, of course, you would look at Italy as well. And then you have other pictures, like, for example, I don't know, this is the century of the Vikings, so you can say, especially in Northern Europe, there was much less social stratification, wealth, and so you would have mostly infantry armies. Think about the Anglo-Saxons numerically. Well, in post-Carolingian Europe, it's different. You have an elite of mounted professionals. But you want to look in that sense as the fact that this was actually a superior, military superior system, and that still included infantry, that was thus also even more effective together with cavalry. So even though we are, of course, fascinated with, say, Northern European warfare to the degree we imagine this beautiful sort of phalanxes of Norsemen clashing against one another, against, you know, the Anglo-Saxons and beyond, still, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're sort of the most updated or relevant military existing at the time. But they were tough, right? So actually I realized we must make so much more Viking history content. I'm thinking to start a series of some sort because it's so relevant. We made so few. It can't last like this. But at the same time, let's also be honest about the objective relevance that military systems have, especially when you start actually comparing them in a broader diachronic and comparative, diachronic faction, but also across Europe, right? And not simply just because, I don't know, you like this or that more for other reasons. So when you look back at Landulf, so this Milanese account of the 11th century, you can't avoid to see how more present infantry mentions really are in the same Lombard warfare. Let's talk about Landulf as well, because we can better understand this historical figure known for being himself a leader of the Pataria movement and the successor of Erlembald himself. In fact, in this case, little information about his life is available, primarily from a letter by Peter Damian, as well, and various narrative sources that depict him in contrasting ways, given the ideologically heightened period of the time, and depending on whether they support, in fact, or oppose the Pataria movement. Landulf is described as being of noble origin and a member of the higher clergy of the Milan cathedral, with several accounts highlighting his social elevation. These were some of the highest, again, ecclesiastical officials in Europe, right? A hypothesis regarding Landulf's descent from a specific family has been rejected. There is skepticism regarding even his potential candidacy for the Archbishopric of Milan. He is recognized as one of the first supporters of Ariald, that, as we've seen, had preceded Erlembald. So there is a continuity here and a broader political vision in the narrative. Ariald had begun preaching against the corrupt clergy in 1057, thus initiating the Pataria movement. His alliance with Ariald is noted as a fundamental aspect of the contractual character of the movement itself. Sources also portray Landulf as ambitious and willing to do anything for power, though indications of his unfulfilled desire for a monastic life exist, and this especially in the context, for example, the Vallombrosan background. This was more, as you know, a Tuscan thing. We talked about this for 11th century Florence. I made a video. If you're interested in knowing what was happening, at least in the most important, what was to become the most important Tuscan city, of course, tell us that there was a lot of tension, a lot of spiritual concreteness about the ultimate problem of the empire. What was to be made of this empire and papal power that was affirming itself now in a fully hierarchical sense as a monarchy in a universe parallel to the imperial one. These men were holding the reins of the most important cities in Europe on the basis of such struggle that was thus not just political but theological, cultural, and the ultimate point was, how to ensure the salvation of mankind, as a matter of fact, through the same use of arms, by the way. So it's that straightforwardly traditional and Catholic in nature. That's why the way these authors portray the military matters a lot, because these were the forces of the empire. And so when you see this guy that is active across the entire 11th century, writing at the end of it, you can spot how it had become in his vision, in his historiography, that is never sort of anecdotal, right? It's still very dense. Like if he mentions a type of trooper rather than another, that there is some deeper meaning to that. It's not just a story without meaning. It has become entirely normal to view every army as composed of a minority of milites and a majority of pedites. Not because it had ever been different from before, but let's say if you look at Liutprand, at least he will just talk about the milites. And the pedites were there. It's just that they had not yet acquired that greater relevance that especially the tumultuous growth of the same land would provide. This was true also for the entirety of Lombardy and Europe. For example, we have different passages. Landulf says that the Emperor Lambert would besiege Milan with militibus et peditibus. So the fact that he mentions them is relevant compared to the previous historiography. It means times have changed. Otto I goes to Rome cum innumerabili atque ineffabili peditum virorum fortium multitudine. And here we have an extra detail, that is to say, it's not just, it's an innumerable, uncountable amount of troops. But these are of infantrymen, right? But this is such an ineffable force, and it's not just made up of pedites, but pedites vires fortes, right? A multitude of strong men on foot, right? So these are not pedites in the sense of some second-class people, like you would have again more or less, for example, north of the Alps. Pedites vires fortes. So there is a very strong, also moral. We've talked about virtus in the European tradition, like value attached to these infantrymen. They're chiefs. They're people of. Here, remember, Otto goes to Rome because he also has his Italic subjects in his army. And in fact, this expedition is swollen by this multitude that Landulf talks about. But this is also true for the enemies of Milan. For example, Conrad II besieges the city with peditum multitudine ineffabili as well. So we're talking a large amount of infantry that now becomes obviously relevant. If anything, if you want to besiege a city like Milan, you needed large amounts of infantry to begin with. We've seen this was true even for, I don't know, some, Slavic hilltops on the Elbe in the 10th century for the Teutonic army. You can imagine how 11th century Lombardy would fare, like, and so like, the largest city in the empire would require in order to be besieged. So while in reference to his city, Landulf initially speaks generically of cives bellatores, so literally warring citizens, he later distinguishes them between boni milites and strenuissimi cives, and finally, more clearly, between milites strenuissimi and pedites fortes. This is also radically important, because if you know the Latin terms, of course, you can hear, first of all, cives bellatores, again, the warrior citizens. There is the full sense of, again, of the Romano-Germanic free citizenry in arms that, remember, in the Catholic tradition stands for not just freemen, but noblemen, right? If you studied the actual foundation of the Italian communes, the mentality of these people expressed that even though there were people of different status and ranks, the fact that you were a civis, that could be also in fact a pedis, an infantryman, because it was not affluent enough to be a knight, entailed nobility. A nobility that derives from the exercise of arms, right? This is radically important. You don't find this. If you wonder why these cities would become what they would become, and why they were more advanced than any other urban context in Europe, from any political, military, and social point of view, remember what their mentality was. Without that, you cannot understand who they were. And then, of course, these cives, you see, Landulf puts even the milites and the pedites on this, within this cives warring character, and that's the pride of Milan. He distinguishes between boni milites, so good but intended as qualitatively, say also from a moral point of view, good knights, and strenuissimi, which means most sort of enduring, courageous, valid citizens, which in this sense entails not necessarily pedites, because the terminology is precise. I mean, being a miles required also a certain degree of societal acceptation of sort of further, formalization of the status, right? What would become the dubbing, that was already a thing at this time, that initiating form of sort of warband mentality behind knighthood. So you could be technically a civis that would fight on horseback, but that was not a miles. I'm not sure whether Landulf uses the term equites plural, for example, to or other sort of more Germanic terminology, like or this Celto-Germanic deriving from caballus, for example, caballari, etc. This was used by the Longobards, for example, as well. But this distinction between boni milites and strenuissimi cives also tells you how, of course, the milites were a bit above the same concept of civis in an average sense. So it depends really on the semantics, on the context of the phrase, and again, you must be sort of a bit of a philologist, other than also just an historian, to get that as a shading, as a shaded definition. But finally, you have this again, milites strenuissimi. So you see that the strenus can be applied to the miles as well, meaning that these were also pretty tough son of Blippus. And pedites fortes, which is even the proper term for saying these were like stout, strong, and this infantry meant that stands for. You see how many positive, very strongly traditionally Latin military terminology to define the military and moral quality at the same time of the citizens of Milan, including those who fought on foot. Right, that's how strongly they felt about their own community, how convinced they were of their innate moral superiority. This is overwhelmingly important, right? Overwhelmingly important. And even, of course, these pedites, again, you don't find this in the same way in Europe. You don't find it. You find like large numbers of footmen, whatever, but you don't have this sort of interest much in what kind of quality the infantry is, right? What I wanted to say also that is pedites could, as we'll see now, also not define like the entirety of troops that fought on foot. Just as we said, milites wouldn't necessarily define the entirety of the troops who fought on horseback, right? You could banally have people that fought in the army. There was some more elite foot force that was more habitually, for example, through a rota system specializing in that direction. We have seen this also in the Ottonian army in general, like also in Germany. And this had been the case really in all over post-Carolingian Europe, because the peasantry had to be left a bit alone in order to support like an effective fighting force. The same city in itself is the product of the surplus of the countryside in a way, and so the control that these men must have on the surroundings, also in virtue of their own superiority, and asserting this control in arms, right? Which is exactly what also Milan will keep incrementally doing, like also triggering the intervention of the Holy Roman Emperors and even managing to defeat them and winning her own rights to subjugate the other community at the Peace of Constance. That's really where that all stems from. It's incredibly important. And so even the pedites of Milan, especially as chiefs, not simply other people that wouldn't have really civic rights in the city, but there were, this is incredibly important to stress, were considered a military elite. Remember, nobility. Even as infantry. Again, it's exactly the same what that, the Germanic emperors, when coming back in the 12th century, like in the mid-12th century, after all the issues that had followed to Worms and the clashes between the Welf and the Hohenstaufen in Germany already, said, is this how these guys actually think and how they actually create all this? Yeah, and that's insane. That's the level that also of cultural misunderstanding. Like, because, if you have, again, like, habituated yourself to a world in which the entire reality is feudal, that the peasants are just basically some serfs under, a princes that control basically everything, and there are even such big cities, such, individual wealth, it's literacy, organization, traffic. You do not understand this. It's like very advanced. Like the stage of, again, civilizational development is insane. Like, still, you can see it even from a historiographic point of view. Reading at the stories that were written, say, in the Italic kingdom compared to, I don't know, Lotharingia or rather, like it's different. It's beyond, right? And so, going back at Landulf's ideas of the Milanese military, you realize that he identifies essentially two different estates, right? Despite their social differentiation, however, they are both characterized by adjectives that are intended to flatter, thereby elevating their respective military value to an almost equal standing, which, in the case in which these guys were fighting against imperial interference, was a very powerful political message, right? And to the Germanic authority, like saying, we are all fighters, we are all endowed with a spirit of unity and of strength that goes beyond, like as a wedge that is not going to be stopped. Although the distinction between milites and pedites is of course primarily technically significant, as it pertains to those who operate on foot or mounted, their various social connotations over time should not be overlooked. Like during the early decades of the 11th century, the citizen milites still identified with an elite possessing public and ecclesiastical wealth, and enabled them to equip and train themselves for mounted combat. In other words, the sense is that these troops belong to a higher sphere of establishment. They are, as we've seen from the previous centuries, also deriving from the vassalatic beneficiary establishment and their military clienteles, and now they have come to live in the city, and so they are sort of connected with the local vassals, the local bishop, because technically, yes, of course, all these communities have the old sense of there is a count, there is a bishop that rule specifically the city. So it's not like the city is a place where there is no feudal authority. There always is, because it's actually public authority. The important is who does hold the regime. That's what counts. Like, and that's where it doesn't even make sense to think that the later communes also were anything sort of incompatible with the tradition. So who are the pedites in this tactical terms? Well, those are the heirs of the freemen that, despite engaging in other activities other than, in fact, warfare in a professional sense, like the milites did, this is the actual difference, had been required since the early Middle Ages to provide armed service for the so-called defensio patria, the defense of the fatherland, right? The city-states had, of course, a recruitment system based on census, for which, if you were wealthy, you had to contribute with your own means. And this was also normal everywhere, but the level of wealth that you could squeeze out of these specific communities at the lower level was much higher than what it was habitually among, the other pedites in the rest of Europe. And this came together with some civic duties as well. It's like when you look at, the Roman army, like the equites were like something up really on their own, right, as the knightly class. But still, like, there were people who served in the army that had a voting right, that they weren't, in fact, really counting much, because the patricians and the equites basically monopolized the entire system as this upper oligarchy, right, aristocracy. Here it's fundamentally the same. That's why also when you look at the Romanity of this people's legacy, also their civic organization, look at the consuls that found the communes in a political, institutional sense. Like, it's these people, like, it emerges from the elite, right? And so when you look at the role of the infantry, and you realize that even those who would have been connected with the milites still talk a lot about the pedites, you realize that the latter had arisen to a very important level, even in their subordination. The pedites also possessed traditional military capabilities, which in Milan even enabled them to successfully challenge the hegemony of the milites in the city streets. In fact, Milan will always remain characterized during the Middle Ages by this balance between the milites, so let's say the vassals, traditional feudal elements, the bishop is very powerful, and the people. That all balance each other very, very effectively, and they do maintain a pretty straightforwardly robust regime. In fact, Milan will be the most successful of the various Italian city-states during the Middle Ages. There is a reason at the root of this, and just by making these videos, I'm realizing how much there is really to cover about these topics. It's utterly insane, like how much people have no idea and how few content there is out there about this stuff. And so among Milites and pedites, turnover appears to be very active as well. We documented it before, like cavalry has not yet fully reached its peak or its full distinction, like even society is not that stratified as we've become later. Already in the time of Landulf, the initial equation of miles vastus has been replaced by that of miles equus tendentially, irrespective of the social origin of those who fight on horseback. This is, as we were saying before, telling the truth, a matter of general expression. Of course, say it's not like every literal miles is the same, right? We know too few, unfortunately, about the classes of recruitment at this point, but of course there wasn't just like you were a horseman point, so you're the heavily armored guy. No, there was something less, so you could say the less could be called equus rather than miles occasionally, and this is something mostly that you grasp from the chronicles, the narrative sources. But at large, the sense that essentially a knight is, say, the milites are sort of compact, an homogeneous body that also in a political and civic sense act in a similar fashion, and they essentially nurture each other in this position, is typical already of this era, even before the affirmation of the consular regime, that is actually just a consequence of that. This is extremely important. And the equation, of course, becomes even more valid in the 12th century, when a large proportion of knights and infantry are no longer socially the same as those from the previous era. Among them, however, the so-called people without arms continues to exist in the city. For example, in the Gesta Federici Primi Imperatores in Lombardia, authored by a citizen of Milan, we get this is another chronicle that this notion that on August the 8th, 1161, so we're at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, as you understand, the years of the Lombard League, in response to a German attack at the Casinum Tome, which was a locality, likely a fortified farm, egressus est autem populus sine armis quidam de militibus et peditibus cum armis exirunt. This is really meaningful. Basically, you have the Germans attacking this post that was presumably owned by someone, like some aristocrat and his clientele. And this is very interesting because also the wars of the First Lombard League are actually still very primitive and archaic times. And so you have always this degree of sort of medieval ambiguity in terms of public and private. But exactly because we witness here an expedition to protect what was the possession of a Milanese citizen, or Milanese protected territory anyway, would cause effect, would mirror that level of civic and public intervention. And what does the source say? Basically, it says that together with the milites and the pedites that sallied forth from Milan to break the German attack, there is a populus sine armis, which is also pointed out by the source, which is also strange. Like you don't find it often in many other sort of, even just in communal Italy and general. That is the specification that there were some troops basically were not equipped, they were not armed, right? And that, however, were essentially and as likely serving as a reservoir for which new infantry can emerge to replace those who have advanced to the higher category. So in other words, you have bodies, right, that you can, or at least of people that also minds that know how to wield those weapons, that however at some point will have to be used for like turns for, in fact, alternating combat, which is a very interesting aspect of this way of war that you rarely find elsewhere. Normally you have the troops entirely, and that's more or less the army which we are going to fight. We often don't think about the general fatigue and etc. Maybe in this case it's also because the mother city is close, so you can have, but you see, you bring them with you, right? During this engagement, to essentially give support to troops that will have fought, but at some point they can, despoil themselves of their arms, giving them to fresher people that do not need to come in arms, which of course refers to some sort of reserves, like not to troops that are likely thought to be the spearhead of the formation. Like mostly you would go out there with troops that in fact you will have to fight with, but in a more concrete way, when in a sort of the emergential situation, you would employ in part to just substitute with this reserve that in the meanwhile could, by the way, be very very active in other tasks like field aids, pioneers, like logistics, like camp stuff, like all the stuff that shows like the participation even of troops that are not even meant to fight, but that per se, but they can't always do, right, by according to the circumstances. This is again incredibly relevant. It is incredibly interesting, and it refers to the general militarization expected from the population at large. And so again, this is pretty much it, right? We'll have to talk way more about the Milanese army, the general development of the Italian communal forces, because as you understand, video after video, these are likely the single most criminally underrated forces in medieval Europe, and we sort of don't want to accept somehow that at some point we failed at history, like if, at least as a people, like in general. Sometimes you don't even have historiography caring about this part, right? It's like, I don't know, we'll just study what happened, in a narrower context, that if I don't know the history of another country, I don't study it. Why? But especially in this case, right? Because this is definitely no fringe, and yet, again, no valid historical reason not to in fact to appreciate this. I could say more, because obviously there is, I don't know how many videos, for example, I made on Milan. Let's check out, because in the last year I think we are I especially with the original series, that is something that I decided to direct to this. We passed to sort of the bigger cities, because at the beginning I thought like we'll talk more often about them than not, but the cycle wasn't so rewarding in a sense. So we'll strange, because this was mostly for Milan and Florence, and surprise, the cycle provided us with more Florentine history than also the lots we already made on. And so on Milan we have 11 videos, which I would say it's starting to be something. It's definitely too few. We should actually have more, because again, proportionally, it's should have at least 20, I think. It's also really a matter of will. This was, for example, a so-called special now. As you understand, in the late, like in the end of the week, I make these specials, and let's see how much we have on medieval Lombardy, for example. 17 videos, and not so many views. Even here the description is because I inserted some descriptions just to have sort of more how do you even change this? Alright, we'll add up to that, but you see, we haven't like constituted a real fabric of this all, right? We must add to it, and yeah, sometimes it's more difficult again than we tend to realize. I mean, to cover Europe in an homogeneous fashion, it feels that for how many videos I make, there is always some sort of, we haven't covered this or that yet. And sometimes I realize, oh, you know what, we actually did. You know, here I see this video, here I see this one I had forgotten. We actually talked about this already a bit, but we're really at the beginning. Like at this rhythm I can make just so far, 300 videos a year, but this is the only way to cover certain topics. This is the only way to actually be honest, to be complete about the wall. I can't think of any other way to simply go out there and say, okay, how do you select the topics? Believe me, it's not easy. And I mostly cover the Middle Ages, and I know that most people do not even care about the Middle Ages. I've gotten bitterly this impression that if I had dedicated my channel just, I don't know, to modern history, people would have watched much more. If I had done the same with ancient history, would have been the case. People don't have, generally speaking, a medieval historical culture. And it's that painful, unfortunately. Like, you must really acknowledge that at large there is no there is still like the sense that whatever happened in the Middle Ages was not important. Like I talk in my adult life to other adults regarding the Middle Ages, and even as a child I remember that I would be struck by these cliches about the Middle Ages from even adult people, and I said, what the hell? And the more I went on, the more I realized you still have people say, the Middle Ages were weak, or like this kind of strange statements like, I don't know, they were a bad time, they were a dark time, like, how exactly? Like, because it's not that straightforward, right? It's not like ancient history. People ever say that about ancient history, right? And there were, if you're talking about actual hardship in lifestyle, they weren't actually that bad, especially in fact in the contexts like these, right? Especially if you have again this primitivistic, catastrophistic view of the Middle Ages, you think everybody was poor and weak and were exposed to strange, enemies and natural events. Like, don't you realize it's sort of, the history of mankind, for most of its history, not just the Middle Ages, but if you want to put it at that level of pathetic sort of almost complaint towards that, but you will have missed really the single most traditionally important parts of it all, not just in our romantic, decadent reality, but in the sense that you fail at realizing how you have what you have because medieval people took a leap forward and created an immense civilization filled with an immense level of accomplishment, of civilization, of, in this case, of wealth, of power, and more. It's really insane how the Middle Ages have been interpreted in this fashion. Honestly, I see much more horrifying things happening from certain comments of people from the contemporary era that are so narrow-minded and radicalized that they think that, I don't know, very well-known macroscopic historical events in the last generations are false, or they have the whiny pseudo explanation that actually they never even provide for why it's the false story. Nobody told you the truth, but at the end of the day, it's nothing, right? If you want to understand history, you have, first of all, to understand all of it. It doesn't make any sense to pretend that you live in a mega scam and you're actually the person who doesn't know anything about it all. Believe me, I study history full time, and it's not like I'm even satisfied about my own situation. The more I study and the more I realize how much I don't know. I've always been aware of that, but more than else, it's about the realization that our lack of knowledge is willing, like that you at the root of it have decided not to study particular things. And that's again the thing that shocks me the most, because people are so evidently parochial and sort of obscurantistically hiding the rest of of history. Like, I have people complaining. I make, for example, these videos that, as you understand, are very researched and thought out and sort of articulated. Like, they're important, right? These videos are, people don't want to listen to them because it's just like a normal academic lesson, and they think that, I don't know, they don't have the time to listen to it, so they tend to put the excuse that since they don't understand what it says, it must not be good. Even though that's exactly when they also start, if they have to start describing it, you understand that they haven't even listened to that. So you understand how cowardly and vile the attitude towards actual history, like the actually qualitative side of history is. The people don't want to be educated. People don't want, they are absolutely phobic of standards. They're absolutely incapable of accepting that they are severely under-educated and brought up, and as such, they really can't grasp most of what the world is. And this gets down to political decisions. I mean, if you, again, don't know history in general, and if you think that you can make only the history that you want, or listen just to what doesn't challenge you, but you're automatically disqualified as a human being at a deep existential level. You're basically done for in terms of any kind of real development in a moral, personal, and cultural sense. Right? So it's vital to realize how necessary our history actually is, and it can't really be otherwise. All right, we must really start from this. We must really start from the realization that without this kind of history, you really can't go anywhere. And you can make your best by supporting Schwerpunkt for what it's really worth it, for the fact that we're not here to play dolls, and we have actually a pretty substantial interest in maintaining things at this level. So let's be also adult about this. Let's recognize where value lays, and let's make a favor to everyone by by helping this enterprise. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.